The bruise beneath Grace Morrison's left eye had turned the color of rotting plums, spreading down her cheekbone like spilled wine. And when the cowboy named Victor Whitmore first saw her standing in the afternoon light of the general store in La Veta, Colorado, something inside his chest constricted with a fury he had not felt since the war ended 15 years prior in 1865. The year was now 1880, and the mountain town nestled in the Sangre de Cristo Range still held onto its rough edges, despite the railroad bringing civilization closer each passing season. Grace kept her head down as she counted coins from a worn leather purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she placed them on the counter, and Victor noticed how she positioned herself so the unswollen right side of her face remained visible to the proprietor. "That will do fine, Mrs. Morrison," the shopkeeper said, his voice carefully neutral in the way people spoke when they chose not to see what stood directly before them. Grace nodded and gathered her parcels with movements that suggested each gesture cost her something in pain, and Victor watched as she turned toward the door. Their eyes met for just a moment, hers a startling green even through the injury, and he saw fear flash across her expression before she quickly looked away and hurried past him into the street. Victor had been in La Veta for 3 weeks, working as a ranch hand for the Silverton Cattle Company while he figured out his next move westward. At 32 years old, he had spent the better part of a decade drifting from job to job, never quite finding a place that felt like it could hold him. The war had taken something from him, some ability to settle that other men seemed to possess naturally. But when he followed Grace out onto the wooden sidewalk and saw her pause to steady herself against a post, her packages clutched to her chest like a shield, he felt an unfamiliar pull to stay exactly where he was. "Madam," he said, keeping his distance so as not to startle her. "You need help carrying those." She turned quickly, too quickly, and winced at the motion. Up close, the damage to her face looked even worse than it had in the dim interior of the store. The swelling extended to her jaw, and there was a cut on her lower lip that had scabbed over but still looked angry and fresh. "No, thank you," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite everything her face told him. "I am perfectly capable." "Did not mean to suggest otherwise," Victor said, touching the brim of his hat. "Just seemed like you might have your hands full is all." Grace studied him for a moment, and he could see her making calculations behind those green eyes. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a plain blue dress that had been mended in several places. "I appreciate the offer, but my husband is expecting me home." The way she said the word husband carried a weight that confirmed what Victor's instincts had already told him. "That how you got hurt?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Your husband?" Her expression shuddered immediately, and she straightened her spine despite the obvious discomfort it caused. "I fell down the stairs," she said, the lie coming out smooth and practiced. "It was an accident. I am clumsy sometimes." Victor had heard that particular lie more times than he could count. His own mother had said similar things when he was a boy, before his father finally drank himself to death and freed them both. "No stairs in sight right now, and you are moving like someone who knows exactly where the pain is going to come from before it arrives," he said. "That does not come from being clumsy." Grace's face flushed, the color visible even through the bruising. "You have no right to speak to me this way, sir. You do not know anything about my situation." "I know enough," Victor said. He glanced down the street toward where a man stood outside the saloon, watching them with an expression that made Victor's jaw tighten. The man was perhaps 40, thick through the middle, with a red face that spoke of too much whiskey and too little conscience. "That him." Grace followed his gaze and her entire body went rigid. "I have to go," she said quickly, starting down the sidewalk with hurried steps that clearly hurt her. Victor watched her cross the dusty street, watched her husband grab her arm hard enough to make her flinch, watched them disappear around the corner toward the residential section of town. He stood there for a long moment, his hands curling into fists at his sides, before he made himself turn away and head back toward the livery where he had boarded his horse. But he could not stop thinking about Grace Morrison's green eyes and the practiced way she had delivered her lie. That night, lying in his bedroll in the small room he rented above the livery, Victor stared at the ceiling and tried to convince himself it was not his business. He had learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems rarely ended well for anyone. The smart thing would be to collect his pay at the end of the week and move on to the next town, the next job, the next chapter of his rootless life. Instead, when morning came, he found himself asking questions. The livery owner, an old-timer named Dutch, was happy enough to gossip while they mucked out stalls. Frank Morrison, sure I know him, got himself a pretty young wife about 3 years back. She was teaching school over in Trinidad, came here visiting her aunt and ended up married before the month was out. Frank's got a temper, everyone knows that, but he keeps it mostly behind closed doors if you understand my meaning. Everyone just lets it happen. Victor asked, working his pitchfork through the hay with more force than necessary. Dutch shrugged. What is anyone supposed to do? She is his wife. That is between them and the Lord. Besides, Frank's got connections. His brother is the deputy marshal and his cousin runs the bank. People who cross the Morrison family tend to find life in La Veta gets mighty difficult mighty fast. Victor said nothing, but something hardened in his chest. He had seen this dynamic before, the way small towns protected their own even when their own were monsters. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work, but his mind kept returning to Grace Morrison, wondering if she had anyone in the world who gave a damn about what was happening to her. 3 days passed before he saw her again. This time it was at the church social on Sunday afternoon, a gathering held in the town square with tables of food and children running between the adults. Victor had not planned to attend, but something drew him there anyway, and he spotted Grace sitting on a bench near the edge of the crowd. The bruises had faded to yellow and green, still visible but less shocking than before. She wore a high-collared dress despite the summer heat, and she sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the festivities without participating. Frank Morrison stood near the beer barrel with a group of other men, laughing too loud and drinking too much. Victor positioned himself where he could observe without being obvious, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Every few minutes, Frank would glance over at Grace, and each time he did, she would stiffen slightly, her entire body responding to his attention like a prey animal sensing a predator. She was not watching the social at all, Victor realized. She was watching her husband, tracking his movements, calculating distances and exits without even consciously doing it. Victor made his way around the edge of the crowd until he stood near her bench. "Nice day for a gathering," he said conversationally, not looking directly at her. Grace glanced up, recognized him, and immediately looked away. "Yes," she said quietly. "Mind if I sit?" Victor asked. "Standing gets tiresome after a while." He could see her weighing the consequences, could practically hear her thoughts running through worst-case scenarios. Finally, she gave a small nod and he settled onto the far end of the bench, leaving a respectable distance between them. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the social washed over them, fiddle music and laughter and the shriek of children at play. "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you keep appearing near me?" "I do not rightly know," Victor admitted, Maybe because nobody else seems willing to. I told you it was an accident, and I told you I do not believe that." Grace turned to look at him fully then, and he could see tears gathering in her green eyes. "What do you want me to say? That my husband hits me? That he has been doing it since 6 months after we married? That every time I think about leaving, I remember that I have no money, no family except an aunt who is too old and sick to help me, and nowhere to go that he would not find me? Will saying those things out loud change anything?" The rawness in her voice cut through Victor like a knife. "It might," he said. "If you had someone willing to help you leave." Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You, a drifter cowboy who does not even know me, you would risk crossing Frank Morrison and his entire family for a woman you have spoken to twice. That is either very noble or very stupid, and I have not decided which yet." "Maybe both," Victor said, "but the offer stands regardless." Before Grace could respond, a shadow fell across them both. Frank Morrison stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes narrowed with suspicion and alcohol. "The hell you think you are doing, talking to my wife?" he demanded, his words slurring just enough to be noticeable. Victor stood slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. He was tall, lean from years of hard work, and he knew how to handle himself in a fight if it came to that. "Just passing the time, friend," he said evenly. "No harm meant. I am not your friend," Frank spat, "and my wife does not need to be passing time with saddle tramps. Grace, get up, we are leaving." Grace stood immediately, her face pale, her hands shaking. "Yes, Frank." "I am sorry. I did not mean—" "Shut up," Frank said, grabbing her arm in the same rough way Victor had seen before. Grace gasped at the pressure, and Victor felt his control slipping. "Let her go," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made several people nearby turn to look. Frank laughed. "Or what? You going to make me? This is my wife, Cowboy. I will handle her however I see fit." The next few seconds unfolded with a strange clarity. Victor saw Frank raise his free hand, saw the intention in his eyes before the blow could land, and moved without thinking. He caught Frank's wrist in midair, his grip iron tight, and stared into the other man's reddening face. "You are not going to hit her," Victor said quietly. "Not now, not ever again." Frank jerked backward, yanking Grace with him. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he snarled. "My brother will have you in jail before sundown." "Maybe," Victor said, "but it will be worth it." The crowd had gone silent now, everyone watching the confrontation unfold. Grace looked terrified, her eyes darting between the two men. "Please," she said softly, "please just let it go." "Frank, let us go home. Sir, please, I do not want any trouble." But trouble had already been called forth and could not be easily dismissed. Frank released Grace with a rough shove that made her stumble, then pointed a thick finger at Victor. "You are finished in this town," he said. "Finished." He stormed off, and after a moment's hesitation, Grace followed, glancing back once at Victor with an expression he could not quite read. The crowd slowly returned to their festivities, but Victor could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispers starting to spread. He had just made an enemy of the wrong family, and everyone knew it. Dutch found him an hour later, sitting on the steps of the livery. "You are either the bravest man I have met or the dumbest," the old man said, settling down beside him with a grunt. "Frank Morrison has already been to see his brother. Deputy is looking for you, wants to have a conversation about disturbing the peace." "I disturbed the peace by stopping a man from hitting his wife in public," Victor said flatly. "That is how you see it." "That is not how the deputy is going to see it. My advice, collect your pay and ride out tonight before this gets worse." Victor considered it. It was good advice, sensible advice. But the thought of leaving Grace Morrison behind, knowing what would happen to her now that her husband was humiliated and angry, made something twist in his gut. "I cannot do that," he said finally. "Then you are a damn fool," Dutch said, but there was something almost like respect in his voice. "But I have been a damn fool myself once or twice, so I am not going to judge. Just be careful, son. The Morrison family plays rough." The deputy came by as the sun was setting, a heavy-set man named Tom Morrison who had his brother's same mean eyes. "Need you to come with me," he said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Going to spend a night in jail to cool off. Think about how we treat respectable citizens in La Veta." "Respectable men do not beat their wives," Victor said, but he went along peacefully. Fighting law enforcement, even corrupt law enforcement, was a line he would not cross. The jail was a small stone building with 2 cells, and Tom locked him in the one that smelled of old vomit and despair. "Frank wants to press charges," Tom said conversationally, leaning against the wall. "Assault, harassment, maybe a few other things we will think of. Could be you are looking at 6 months to a year of hard labor. Course, if you agreed to leave town permanent-like, we might could forget the whole thing." "And Grace," Victor asked, "what happens to her when I am gone?" Tom's expression hardened. "Grace is family business. You would do well to remember that." The deputy left, and Victor settled in for a long night. The cell was cold despite the summer evening, and he had nothing but his thoughts for company. He kept seeing Grace's face, the practiced way she delivered her lies, the fear that lived in her eyes. He had known women like her before, had watched his own mother shrink into herself under the weight of his father's fists. But his mother had never had anyone willing to help her escape, had died still wearing her wedding ring and her collection of careful excuses. He was not going to let that happen to Grace Morrison. Morning came with the sound of keys in the lock. Victor expected to see Tom returning with breakfast or more threats, but instead it was Grace herself who stood in the corridor, looking pale but determined. "You have 5 minutes," Tom called from the front office. "That is all I am giving you." Grace approached the cell slowly, her hands clutched together at her waist. "You should not have done what you did yesterday," she said without preamble. "Frank is talking about making an example of you. He wants you sent to the territorial prison in Canyon City." "Worth it if it kept him from hitting you one more time," Victor said, standing and walking to the bars. "But it did not," Grace said, and her voice broke slightly. "It just made everything worse. He was so angry when we got home. I have bruises on top of bruises now." Victor's hands tightened on the bars until his knuckles went white. "Grace, listen to me. You do not have to live like this. Come with me when they let me out. We can leave together, go somewhere Frank cannot find you." "And go where exactly?" Grace asked, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "Do what? I have no skills beyond teaching, and no school will hire a woman who abandoned her husband. I have no money, no prospects. At least now I have a roof and food, even if the price is too high." "The price is your life," Victor said urgently. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually Frank is going to hit you in just the wrong way and you will not get back up. I have seen it happen. Is that really better than taking a chance on something different?" Grace wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "I am so tired," she whispered. "So tired of being afraid all the time. But I am also afraid of hope. Hope is what got me into this mess in the first place. I thought Frank was a good man, thought I was lucky he wanted to marry me. I hoped for a happy life, and look where that got me." "Not all hope is misplaced," Victor said softly. "I am offering you something real, a chance to start over. Yes, it will be hard. Yes, there are no guarantees, but anything is better than staying with a man who uses you as a target for his anger." "Why?" Grace asked, looking up at him with those devastating green eyes. "Why do you care so much about a stranger?" Victor was quiet for a moment, searching for words to explain something he did not fully understand himself. "Because someone should have cared about my mother," he said finally. "And nobody did. She died when I was 17, and to this day I wonder if things might have been different if even one person had reached out a hand to pull her free. I cannot change the past, but maybe I can change the future for you." Grace stared at him for a long moment, and Victor could see the war being waged behind her eyes. Fear and hope battled each other. Years of conditioning and abuse arguing with the desperate human need for something better. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "what exactly are you proposing?" "How would this even work?" "They are letting me out tomorrow on the condition I leave town immediately," Victor said. "I will get my horse, pack my gear, and ride out looking like I am heading west, but I will wait for you at the old mission ruins about 5 miles north of town." "You remember where those are?" Grace nodded. "I have been there a few times. Frank does not like me going far, but sometimes I can convince him to let me visit my aunt on the east side of town. Find a reason to leave the house tomorrow afternoon. Bring whatever you can carry without raising suspicion. I will wait until sunset, and then we ride hard and fast for Trinidad. From there, we can catch a train going anywhere you want. Colorado Springs, Denver, maybe even California. Somewhere Frank Morrison's reach does not extend." "Time is up," Tom called from the front office. Grace glanced over her shoulder, then looked back at Victor. "I do not even know you," she said helplessly. "How can I trust that you are any better than Frank? How do I know this is not some different kind of trap?" "You do not," Victor said honestly. "All you have is my word, and I know how little that might mean right now. But Grace, here is what I can promise you. I will never raise my hand to you in anger. I will never make you fear to speak your mind. And if you decide, once we are away from here, that you want to go your separate way, I will help you do that too. This is about giving you choices, not taking them away." Grace stood there, trembling like a leaf in a high wind, and Victor could see the moment she made her decision. Something shifted in her expression, a kind of desperate courage rising to the surface. "The mission ruins," she said quietly. "Tomorrow afternoon. If I am not there by sunset, it means I could not get away." "I will wait," Victor promised. "Even if it takes longer, I will wait." Grace nodded once, then turned and hurried from the cell block. Victor heard the murmur of voices from the front office, then the sound of the door closing. He sat back down on the narrow cot and released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Tomorrow would either be the beginning of something new or the end of a short-lived hope. Either way, he had committed himself to this path, and he would see it through. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Tom Morrison released him just after dawn, handing over his belongings with a cold smile. "Horse is at the livery," the deputy said. "You have got 1 hour to clear out of La Veta. If I see you after that, I am arresting you again on any charge I can think of." "Understood," Victor said, strapping on his gun belt and settling his hat on his head. He walked to the livery in the early morning light, paid Dutch what he owed, and saddled his buckskin gelding. The horse, a sturdy animal named Ranger, seemed happy to be moving after several days of inactivity. "Heading out?" Dutch asked, leaning on a post and watching Victor work. "Seems that way. Shame. You were a decent worker." The old man paused, then added quietly, "Mission ruins are a good place to rest a horse before a long journey. Quiet, out of the way." A man could wait there a while without being disturbed. Victor glanced at Dutch, saw the knowing look in his eyes, and nodded slowly. "Appreciate the information. Just be careful," Dutch said. "Frank Morrison is not going to take kindly to losing his wife. He will come looking." "Let him come," Victor said, swinging up into the saddle. "I have dealt with worse." He rode out of La Veta heading west, making a show of it for anyone who might be watching. But once he was out of sight of the town, he circled north through the scrub pine and rocky terrain until he found the old mission ruins. The building had been abandoned for decades, its adobe walls crumbling back into the earth, but it provided some shelter from the sun and a good vantage point to watch the northern road. Victor unsaddled Ranger and let the horse graze on the sparse grass while he settled in to wait. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. The sun climbed high, beat down with summer intensity, then began its slow descent toward the western mountains. Victor tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. Frank could have discovered Grace's plans. She could have lost her nerve. She could be lying dead in her house right now, another victim of domestic violence that everyone would agree to forget. The sun was touching the mountain peaks when he finally saw her. Grace appeared on the northern road riding a dappled gray mare, a small bag tied behind her saddle. She was wearing a simple riding dress and had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the heat. Victor stood and walked out to meet her, and when she saw him, her entire face transformed with relief. "I did not think I was going to make it," she said breathlessly as she dismounted. "Frank came home early from the saloon. I had to wait until he fell asleep before I could leave." "You made it. That is what matters," Victor said. "How much time do we have before he realizes you are gone?" "Maybe an hour. Maybe less. He does not sleep deeply when he has been drinking." Grace looked back toward the town, fear evident in every line of her body. "He is going to be so angry. Then we need to move fast." Victor quickly saddled Ranger and helped Grace back onto her mare. "We ride hard for Trinidad. If we push through the night, we can be there by dawn. Once we are on a train, we will be much harder to follow." They rode out as the last light faded from the sky, pushing the horses as hard as they dared on the rough terrain. Victor had traveled this route before and knew the shortcuts, the places where they could cut time without killing the animals beneath them. Grace rode well despite obviously being tired and scared, keeping pace without complaint. The night was cool and filled with stars, the kind of endless sky that made a person feel both insignificant and strangely hopeful. They stopped once to water the horses at a creek and let them rest for a few minutes. Grace dismounted stiffly, and Victor could see her wincing with each movement. "You should have told me you were hurting," he said, offering her his canteen. "We could have gone slower." "No," Grace said firmly. "The pain does not matter right now. Getting away is all that matters." They stood by the creek in the darkness, and Victor found himself studying her face in the starlight. Even bruised and exhausted, there was something luminous about her, a core of strength that Frank Morrison had tried and failed to break. "You are braver than you give yourself credit for," he said quietly. "I do not feel brave," Grace admitted. "I feel terrified, but I am also more myself than I have been in 3 years. Does that make sense?" "It does," Victor said. "Fear means you are alive enough to still hope for better." They rode on through the darkness, and somewhere around midnight, Grace started talking. Maybe it was the movement of the horse beneath her, the rhythm of travel that loosened the tongue, or maybe it was the simple fact that Victor was there and listening. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, her parents dying of fever when she was 16, coming west to live with her aunt and teaching school in Trinidad. She told him about meeting Frank Morrison, how charming he had been in the beginning, how quickly that charm had curdled into possession and violence. "I kept thinking I could fix him," she said, her voice carrying through the night air. "That if I was a better wife, more obedient, quieter, something, he would go back to being the man I thought I married. But that man never really existed, did he? It was all a mask to get what he wanted." "Some people are broken in ways that cannot be fixed," Victor said. "Especially people who do not want to be fixed. That was never your failure, Grace. That was his. As dawn broke over the eastern plains, they crested a rise and saw Trinidad spread out below them, a bustling town of several thousand people where the railroad crossed through on its way to New Mexico. Victor felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Once they were on a train, the hard part would be over. They rode into town as the streets were just beginning to stir with morning activity. Victor found a livery that would board their horses and arranged to sell them both, knowing they could not take animals on the train and could not risk the delay of trying to ship them separately. The livery owner gave them a fair price, and suddenly Victor and Grace were standing on the platform with tickets to Denver and everything they owned in 2 small bags. "What happens now?" Grace asked, looking around at the crowds of people moving through the station. "I have never been to Denver. I do not know anyone there." "Neither do I," Victor admitted, "but it is big enough that Frank will have trouble finding us, and there are opportunities for work. We will figure it out as we go." The train arrived with a blast of steam and the shriek of metal wheels. They found seats in a passenger car, and Grace pressed her face to the window as the train pulled away from Trinidad, watching the town disappear behind them. Victor saw tears streaming down her cheeks and did not say anything, just offered her his handkerchief. "I am not sad," Grace said, wiping her eyes. "I promise I am not sad. I am just overwhelmed. I never thought I would get away. I had resigned myself to living that life until it killed me, and now suddenly everything is different. Different is not always easy," Victor said. "But it is better than what you left behind." The train carried them north through the changing landscape, past Pueblo with its steel mills and up into the high plains. They talked for hours, trading stories and slowly learning each other in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. Victor told her about his childhood, his time in the war, the restless years of drifting that followed. Grace spoke about her dreams of teaching again, of maybe opening her own school someday where children could learn without fear. "Is that realistic?" she asked, laughing a little. "Or am I being foolish?" "I think you can do anything you set your mind to," Victor said, and meant it. They arrived in Denver as the afternoon sun was painting the mountains gold. The city was enormous compared to La Veta, bustling with commerce and energy. Victor found them a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who took one look at Grace's fading bruises and asked no questions beyond whether they needed 1 room or 2. "2," Grace said quickly, and Victor nodded agreement. "For now," he added, meeting her eyes. "Until you decide what you want." They settled into a new rhythm over the following weeks. Victor found work at a freight company, loading and unloading goods from the trains. The pay was decent, and the work was honest. Grace took time to heal, both physically and emotionally, and slowly the woman beneath the fear began to emerge. She was funny, Victor discovered, with a dry wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh. She was intelligent, reading everything she could get her hands on from the Denver Public Library. And she was kind, making friends with the other boarders and helping Mrs. Chen with cooking and cleaning even though it was not required. Victor found himself falling in love with her in small increments, the way she hummed while she folded laundry, the way her face lit up when she talked about books, the way she had started smiling more, real smiles that reached her eyes. But he was careful not to push, not to assume anything. She had been through enough without him adding pressure or expectations. It was Grace who finally bridged the gap between them. They had been in Denver for 2 months, and the nights were getting cooler as autumn approached. Victor had just returned from work and was washing up when Grace knocked on his door. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Of course," Victor said, drying his hands and stepping into the hallway. They walked to a small park a few blocks from the boarding house and sat on a bench overlooking the city. The mountains rose purple in the distance, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. "I have been thinking," Grace said carefully, "about what I want my life to look like going forward." "That is good," Victor said, trying to ignore the way his heart was hammering. "What have you decided?" "I want to file for divorce from Frank," Grace said. "I have been talking to a lawyer Mrs. Chen recommended, and he says I have grounds based on abandonment and cruelty. It will not be easy and Frank might fight it, but I want to try." "I will help however I can," Victor promised. "I know you will," Grace said, and she reached over to take his hand. "That is what I am counting on. Victor, I need you to know something. These past 2 months have been the happiest of my life, even though I have been healing from the worst, and a large part of that happiness is because of you." Victor's breath caught. "Grace, let me finish," she said, squeezing his fingers. "I know we have not known each other very long. I know that by all reasonable measures I should be taking time to be alone, to figure out who I am without a man defining me. And I am doing that work, I promise I am. But I am also realizing that you and we work well together. You make me feel safe in a way I have never felt safe before. You make me laugh. You treat me like I have value beyond what I can provide you. And I think maybe, if you feel the same way, we could build something real together." "I do feel the same way," Victor said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been half in love with you since the first moment I saw you in that general store, but I did not want to rush you, did not want you to feel obligated because I helped you leave." "I do not feel obligated," Grace said firmly. "I feel grateful, yes, but more than that, I feel hopeful. You taught me that hope can be more than a trap. Sometimes hope is the door that lets you walk into the life you were meant to have." Victor turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Then let me say this plainly. Grace Morrison, I love you. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. I want to be the man you come home to at the end of the day, the person you share your dreams with. If you will have me, I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking that chance." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not think I would ever say those words again and mean them, but I do. I love you, Victor Whitmore." He kissed her then, careful and gentle, mindful of everything she had been through. But Grace kissed him back with a fierceness that suggested she was done being fragile, done being handled like something breakable. She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for, including herself. The divorce proceedings took nearly a year to complete. Frank Morrison fought it viciously, hiring lawyers and making threats. But distance and a good attorney on Grace's side prevailed. And in the autumn of 1881, the marriage was legally dissolved. Victor and Grace were married quietly in a civil ceremony the following week, with Mrs. Chen and a few friends from the boarding house as witnesses. They moved into a small house on the edge of Denver, close enough to the city for work, but far enough out that Grace could have the garden she wanted. Victor took a job managing a stable, work that paid better, and gave him more control over his hours. Grace began teaching again, first tutoring children privately, and then taking a position at a new school that had opened for immigrant children. Life was not always easy. Grace still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden movements. Victor still felt the restlessness that had plagued him for years, though it quieted significantly when he was with her. But they worked through these challenges together, learning to communicate, learning to trust, learning what it meant to build a partnership based on respect and love. 2 years after they married, Grace gave birth to a son they named Samuel. Victor held the baby with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the sudden fierce protectiveness he felt for this tiny human. "I will never let anyone hurt you," he whispered to the child. "I promise you that." Grace, exhausted but glowing, smiled at him from the bed. "He is lucky to have you as a father." "We are all lucky," Victor said. "Every single day we are lucky." The years rolled forward with the steady rhythm of a life well lived. Samuel grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved horses and books in equal measure. Grace continued teaching and eventually did open her own small school, a place where children could learn without fear, just as she had dreamed. Victor expanded his stable business into a successful freight operation, hiring good people and treating them fairly. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret when Samuel was 4, and another son named Thomas when Margaret was 3. The house that had seemed large enough at first grew crowded and loud and full of life in ways that made Victor's heart swell. He had never imagined this future for himself, had never believed he was capable of being a husband and father. But Grace had seen something in him that day in La Veta, some core of decency beneath the drifter exterior, and she had called it forth into reality. Sometimes, late at night when the children were asleep and Grace was reading beside him in bed, Victor would think about how easily things could have gone differently if he had not walked into that general store at exactly the right moment. If Grace had not found the courage to meet him at the Mission ruins, if Frank Morrison had caught them before they reached Trinidad, so many small choices and moments of chance that had led them to this life together. "What are you thinking about?" Grace would ask, looking up from her book. "How lucky I am," Victor would say, pulling her close. "How impossibly, unreasonably lucky." Grace never heard from Frank Morrison again after the divorce was finalized. She received word through her aunt that he had remarried, another young woman he had charmed with promises and lies. Grace felt sorrow for the new wife but also recognition that she could not save everyone. She had barely saved herself. When Samuel turned 10, he asked his mother why she had such faint scars on her face. Grace hesitated, then told him a simplified version of the truth. "I was married before I met your father," she said, "and that marriage was not a kind one. Your father helped me get away and build a new life." "So Papa is a hero," Samuel said matter-of-factly. "Yes," Grace agreed, "but I am a hero too." Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help and then accept it when it is offered. Victor's freight business continued to grow, and eventually he had enough money saved to buy a ranch outside Denver. It was not large, just 50 acres with good grazing land and a stream running through it, but it felt like everything Victor had been searching for during all those years of drifting. He raised horses there, bred them carefully, and sold them to people who would treat them right. Grace continued her teaching, traveling into Denver 3 days a week and spending the rest of her time with the children and her ever-expanding garden. She grew vegetables and flowers in equal measure, creating a riot of color around their ranch house that made Victor smile every time he came home. They grew old together, slowly and with grace. Their children grew up and had children of their own. Samuel became a doctor, Margaret a lawyer who fought for women's rights, Thomas a teacher like his mother. Victor and Grace became the kind of grandparents who spoiled shamelessly and told long stories about the old days. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Victor took Grace back to Trinidad. They stood at the train station where they had first arrived together, holding hands and remembering. "Do you ever regret it?" Victor asked. "Taking that chance with a stranger?" "Never," Grace said firmly. "You gave me my life back. Everything I am, everything I have built, started with you being brave enough to see me when everyone else was looking away." "You did the hardest part," Victor said. "You chose to save yourself. I just provided the horse." Grace laughed and kissed him. "You provided a lot more than a horse. You provided hope when I had none. You provided safety when I lived in fear. You provided love when I thought I was unworthy of it. That is more valuable than anything else in this world." They returned to their ranch as the sun was setting, painting the Colorado sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their grandchildren were visiting, running through the yard and filling the air with laughter. Victor and Grace stood on their porch, watching the scene unfold, and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. "We did good," Victor said quietly. "We did," Grace agreed. "We really did." Years continued to pass and the world changed around them. The wild west of their youth faded into memory and legend. Cars replaced horses on many roads, though Victor stubbornly maintained his stable until the very end. Electricity came to their ranch, then telephone lines. The children they had taught grew up and taught children of their own. Victor passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Grace beside him holding his hand. His last words were, "I would do it all again, every single moment, just to end up right here with you." Grace grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 42 years together, 42 years of love and partnership and family. That was more than many people ever received. Grace lived another 7 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her final years writing down her story, wanting future generations to understand where they came from. She wrote about fear and courage, about love and second chances, about the Wild West town where her life had nearly ended and instead found a new beginning. Her last written words were these: "I was a woman beaten down by circumstances and cruelty, invisible to everyone around me. But one cowboy saw me, really saw me, and refused to look away. He offered me his hand and I found the courage to take it. Together we built a life that exceeded any dream I had dared to imagine." If there is a lesson in this story, it is simply this: there is always hope for those brave enough to reach for it, and there is always redemption for those willing to offer their hand to someone in need. Grace Morrison Whitmore died surrounded by love, her hand held by her eldest son, her story complete. She was buried beside Victor on their ranch, under the endless Colorado sky they had both loved so much. Their descendants continued to live on that land for generations, telling the story of how it all began with a cowboy in a general store, a woman with bruises she called an accident, and the moment when courage triumphed over fear. The Wild West may have faded into history, but the love between Grace and Victor remained eternal, a testament to the power of compassion, bravery, and the simple human instinct to reach out and save someone who is drowning. Their story became part of the fabric of their family, passed down through the decades as a reminder that love can flourish even in the hardest circumstances, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is refuse to be a bystander to suffering. In the end, it was not the violence or the fear that defined their story. It was the moment Grace chose hope over resignation, the moment Victor chose action over indifference, and all the beautiful, ordinary days that followed when they chose each other over and over again. That was the real story, the one worth telling, the one worth remembering. And in the vast, wild landscape of the American West, their love stood as proof that even in the roughest terrain, the most precious things can take root and flourish.